Don't let them hear you breathing, the girl whispered, crouched behind the broken fence as 3 tiny wolf pups trembled in the grass. The moon hung low over the field, silver light spilling across their fur, and the smallest one pressed its nose against her palm like it had already decided she was safe. Her name was Alara, and in the pack, names like hers were easy to forget. She was the quiet Omega who mended torn blankets, carried water before sunrise, and kept her eyes down when stronger wolves walked past. Tonight, though, she had found something that mattered more than being invisible. A basket lay tipped on its side near the tree line, its lining damp with dew, and inside it 3 wolf pup princes, still young enough to wobble, still hungry enough to cry softly into the cold night, had been left with nothing but the fading scent of their nursery attendants and a ribbon of royal blue tied around one tiny paw. Alara's chest tightened. No one had come for them. No one had even searched loudly enough to be heard. "It's all right," she murmured, though her voice shook. "I've got you now." The middle pup gave a tiny squeak and nudged against the other 2, then looked up at her with wide amber eyes, as if trying to understand whether this strange girl was friend or danger. Alara tore a strip from the hem of her plain shawl and wrapped it around the coldest one first, rubbing warmth into its small body with careful hands. One by one, the pups settled against her lap, their breathing soft and uneven, their little claws catching harmlessly on her sleeve. They were so small, too small for the weight already resting on their shoulders, too small to know that the kingdom beyond the fields had rules, expectations, and wolves who measured worth by bloodline and strength. Alara did not think of any of that. She only thought of the way their ribs showed through their fur, the way the runt kept trying to nurse on her finger as if hunger had made him forget dignity entirely. She broke the last piece of bread from her pocket and held it out in tiny crumbs. The pups gobbled it with desperate, trembling mouths, and something inside her ached at the sound. Slowly, she whispered, smiling despite herself, "There's enough for all of you." A branch snapped somewhere beyond the trees. Alara froze, lifting her head as the wind changed. For one suspended second, the field seemed to hold its breath. Then the heavy scent of pine and cold steel rolled over the grass, strong, unmistakable, impossible to mistake. The pups stiffened in her arms. Alara's heart skipped. She knew that scent. Every wolf in the territory knew it, even if they had only sensed it once in their lives. The Alpha King. He was near, and somewhere in the darkness, closing in faster than the wind, he had finally found the 3 little princes she had hidden. Alara did not move. The cold scent had wrapped around the field like a warning, and every instinct in her body told her to stay still, breathe slowly, and keep her hands around the tiny lives trembling against her chest. One of the pups gave a soft whimper, and she lowered her chin at once, pressing a finger gently to its nose. "Hush," she breathed, her voice barely more than the rustle of grass. "It is all right. Just stay with me." The footsteps came closer, measured and quiet, until the shadow of a tall figure stretched over the broken fence. Alara could not see his face yet, only the outline of broad shoulders and the dark fall of a cloak that moved like storm clouds in the night wind. Around him, the air seemed to tighten. Even the grass looked stiller beneath his passing. She had heard stories since childhood. The Alpha King did not walk into a place without the land itself seeming to remember him. He was the kind of ruler who made grown wolves lower their heads before he even spoke. Alara swallowed, feeling the 3 pups curl tighter against her arms. They were too small to understand fear, but they understood her heartbeat. That was enough. "Step away from them," a deep voice said from the darkness, calm and low, as if he had all the time in the world. Alara lifted her face. Her heart thudded once, hard enough to hurt. The man standing before her was not what the stories had prepared her for. His expression was severe, yes, and his presence was so strong it seemed to pull the night around him. But his eyes were fixed on the pups with something quieter than command, something sharper than anger. Recognition. The largest pup stirred first, lifting its tiny head with a weak sound that made the Alpha King go still. Alara felt the change before she understood it. The air shifted. His gaze dropped to the little one in her arms, then to the second, then the third, and for a single breath the powerful king looked not like a ruler crossing a boundary, but like a man who had been searching for something precious for far too long. "Where did you find them?" he asked. Alara wet her lips, trying to steady her voice. They were alone by the riverbank. The words sounded too small in the open field. She hesitated, then added, hungry, cold. No one else was there. The king's jaw tightened, though not in anger at her. It was something deeper, something that seemed to pass through him, like pain held behind iron control. He took one slow step closer, and the pups in her arms did not flinch. They only relaxed, as if some forgotten thread inside them had gone taut and suddenly gone loose. That frightened Alara more than his size, more than the authority in his voice, because it meant they knew him. Or perhaps they knew what he was to them before she did. The smallest pup, still nestled against her sleeve, reached toward him with a trembling paw. Alara could not have let go if she had wanted to. Easy, she whispered, but the king was already kneeling before her in the grass, lowering himself until his face was level with the pups. The motion was so quiet, so careful, it stole the breath from her chest. The ruler who could command an entire pack had bent to the ground for 3 starving little lives. His hand hovered for a moment before touching the air near them, not forcing, not taking. Just there, waiting. The oldest pup leaned toward him first, sniffing the sleeve of his coat. The king exhaled slowly, almost like relief, and Alara saw something raw flicker across his face before he masked it again. They should not have been left alone, he said. His voice had gone rough around the edges. Alara looked down at the pups, then back at him. No, she answered softly. They should not have. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The field held them in its silence, moonlight silvering the broken fence, the tall grass, and the 3 tiny princes who clung to an omega nobody had ever bothered to notice before tonight. Then the king's eyes lifted to hers, and the look there was no longer only royal. It was searching. It was certain. You have kept them alive, he said. Alara's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the smallest body in her arms. She did not know what answer he wanted, only that the truth mattered now in a way it had not a minute ago. I could not leave them, she said. The words were simple, honest. The king stared at her for one long beat, as if weighing the shape of her heart against everything he had expected to find. Somewhere behind them, another wind rose across the field, carrying the deep pulse of approaching wolves. More than one, many more. Alara heard it and felt her stomach tighten, but the king rose in one smooth motion and turned his body just enough to shield her from the direction of the sound. Not openly, not dramatically, simply instinctively, as if protecting her and the pups had become the same motion. No one takes them from you, he said, and the certainty in his voice made her chest ache in a way she could not name. The words were not loud, yet they settled over the grass like a vow. And in the dim silver light, with 3 hungry princes tucked against the arms of a forgotten Omega, the Alpha King finally realized he had arrived too late to find the pups first, but exactly in time to find the girl who had saved them. Alara had thought the silence would help her breathe. Instead, it only made every small sound seem larger. The faint rustle of grass, the soft, uneven breaths of the 3 pups pressed close beneath her cloak, the distant movement of wolves gathering beyond the field, and beside it all, the Alpha King stood with that same still, watchful presence, as if he had become part of the night itself. His gaze kept returning to the pups, not with suspicion now, but with something far more difficult to name. Alara felt it in the way he looked at them, in the way his shoulders eased whenever one of the little ones settled against her. He was seeing what she had seen first. Not symbols, not titles, just children. Hungry, tired, alive. One of the pups shifted, its small paw finding the edge of her sleeve, and Alara's hand moved at once, careful and practiced, smoothing its trembling body. The king noticed. Of course he did. Nothing in the field seemed to escape him. You have done this before, he said quietly. It was not a question. Alara looked down at the little faces tucked close to her chest and gave the smallest nod. Not with royal pups, she replied. Her voice came out softer than she expected, almost shy in the open dark. But with the frightened, yes. That answer changed something in the air. The king went still. The wind passed between them, brushing her hair across her cheek, and for a moment she thought he might ask more. Instead, his eyes drifted to the empty space beyond the broken fence, toward the sound of approaching wolves that had not yet reached them. Whoever was coming, she knew they would not come quietly. The field seemed to hold its breath with her. Then the Alpha King removed his dark traveling cloak and, without a word, laid it over Alara's shoulders. The gesture was simple, almost careful, but it wrapped around her like heat after a long winter. She blinked up at him, startled by the sudden weight of it, by the scent of cedar and cold night that clung to the fabric. It was the kind of kindness that did not ask permission to matter. "You will get cold," he said. Alara almost laughed at that, because cold had not been the thing she noticed most tonight. It was the fact that no one had ever offered her protection so naturally, as if she were worth the trouble without needing to prove it first. Before she could answer, a low voice called from the far edge of the field. "Your Majesty." The words came with the heavy rhythm of approaching boots, and Alara's pulse tightened at once. 3 shapes emerged from the dark beyond the grass, each one moving with the stiff restraint of men who had traveled too quickly and expected to arrive too late. Advisors, she guessed. Guards, perhaps. Their faces were unreadable until they saw her. Then their eyes dropped, first to the pups, then to the cloak around her shoulders, then to the king standing at her side with a look that needed no explanation. One of the men swallowed hard. Another bowed so quickly it looked more like a stumble. "We searched the eastern woods, Your Majesty," he said. "We did not expect to find them here." The king did not turn his head. "And yet," he said, his tone calm enough to be dangerous, "here they are." Alara's fingers tightened gently around the smallest pup as the air changed again. The men had noticed her now, truly noticed her, and she could feel the old reflex rise in her chest, that familiar urge to shrink, to disappear, to make herself smaller than the space she occupied. But the cloak on her shoulders kept her from retreating. So did the king's hand, which shifted just enough to rest near her back, not touching, not claiming, simply there. It was a promise without words. One of the arriving wolves stared at the pups. "They are hungry," he muttered, almost to himself. Alara lifted her chin. "Yes," she said. "That is why I fed them." The honesty of it made the guards glance at one another, uncertain what to make of a girl who spoke so plainly while standing in the middle of a royal search. The Alpha King did not look uncertain at all. He looked at her as if the answer fit something he had already begun to understand. Behind the tension of the field, behind the waiting wolves and the dark trees and the question of what would happen next, he was still studying her face like it held the shape of a truth he had not expected to find. And somewhere in that steady gaze, Alara felt the first fragile hint of something else begin to awaken, not fear this time, but the dangerous possibility of being seen. The first thing Alara noticed was the way the Alpha King stopped moving. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a slight stillness, as if the night itself had paused to listen with him. His attention had drifted beyond the field, past the broken fence, past the gathered wolves, and toward the 3 small shapes tucked beneath her cloak. The pups were trying so hard to be brave. One had his nose pressed against her sleeve, breathing in quick, shallow puffs. Another kept blinking as though sleep might catch him if he held still long enough. The smallest had fallen half asleep against her chest, his tiny body warm and trembling at the edges. Alara kept one arm around them all, careful and steady, as though her own body could become a shelter if she held it firmly enough. "They should not be out here," one of the guards said at last, his voice low with unease. "Neither should she," another muttered. But no one stepped forward. No one reached for the children. The Alpha King's gaze lifted from the pups to Alara's face, and there was something in it now that made her pulse tighten in a strange, uncertain way. Not judgment, not suspicion, something quieter, sharper, like recognition trying to find its name. He studied the worn edges of her cloak, the dirt on her boots, the way her fingers kept smoothing over the smallest pup's back in small, calming strokes. He seemed to notice everything. The exhaustion at the corners of her eyes, the protective angle of her shoulders, the fact that she had placed herself between the children and every stranger in the field without a second thought. "You have been here all night," he said. His voice was deep, but there was no cruelty in it, only that same measured calm that made everyone else in the field hold their breath. Alara did not look away. "Yes." A pause. Then, softer, almost careful, "Why?" The question hung between them. Why had she stayed? Why had she hidden them? Why had she fed 3 hungry wolf pups when she had so little herself? Alara's throat tightened, but she answered anyway because the truth had never felt dangerous to her in the same way silence did. Because they were alone. The words were simple, plain, nothing grand in them. Yet the field went quiet around her, as if even the wind had softened. The king's expression did not change much, but something inside it shifted, deep and unmistakable. He looked at her as though she had just opened a door he had not known was there. One of the pups stirred at the sound of his voice and lifted his head. The tiny creature stared toward the king with sleepy, uncertain eyes, then yawned and tucked itself back against Alara as if the decision had already been made. The smallest one followed a moment later, reaching one paw toward the cloak that covered her knees. A strange, almost invisible tension moved through the watching wolves. Not danger, not fear, something more fragile than either. The king noticed it too. His eyes narrowed just slightly, not in warning, but in thought. "You trust her," he said, not to Alara, but to the pups. It was not a question. It was an observation spoken with the kind of quiet disbelief that only came when truth arrived before pride had time to resist it. Alara lowered her gaze then, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt beneath so many eyes. Yet the king did not embarrass her. He did the opposite. He stepped half a pace forward, enough that his shadow reached the edge of her cloak, not enough to threaten. "Stand," he said gently. Alara hesitated. Her knees ached from kneeling in the cold grass so long, and her arms were full of sleeping little bodies. But the command was not hard. It was patient, so she rose carefully, balancing the pups against her as the field watched in silence. The Alpha King's eyes followed every motion, and when she stood, he did something that made the guards turn their heads. He removed his outer cloak and held it out, not to the pups, but to her. The gesture was so unexpected that Alara froze. "You are cold," he said simply. She stared at him, uncertain whether she had heard him correctly. Kings did not offer their cloaks to forgotten Omegas. Kings did not notice the cold on the skin of a girl like her. And yet he was there, holding the dark fabric in one hand, his expression unreadable except for the steady patience behind it. "Put it on," he added. Alara's fingers tightened around the small, sleeping forms in her arms. The closest guard looked shocked. Another looked offended. But the Alpha King did not seem to care. His attention remained on her alone, as if the whole field could vanish, and still she would be the one thing he refused to overlook. Slowly, she reached for the cloak. The fabric was warm from his body, heavy with a scent that carried both command and restraint. When it settled around her shoulders, the little pups stirred, nestling deeper into the safety of her arms. One of them made a tiny content sound against her chest, and something unreadable crossed the king's face. Alara looked up just in time to catch it. Not possession, not triumph, something more dangerous than both. It looked almost like relief, as if some part of him had been searching all this time for proof that the world could still be gentle, and now it stood right in front of him in the shape of a tired Omega with 3 sleeping princes in her arms. Behind them, the gathering wolves remained silent. The broken fence, the trampled grass, the moon overhead, pale and watchful. Everything seemed to wait on the next breath. Alara held herself still beneath the weight of that gaze, feeling the strange, impossible truth of it settling into her bones. She had not meant to be seen. She had only meant to keep the pups alive through the night. But now the Alpha King was looking at her as if she mattered, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not know whether that frightened her or gave her hope. The Alpha King did not speak at first. He only watched the 3 little princes breathing softly beneath Alara's cloak, watched the way her arms had tightened around them, as if she could hold back the whole world with nothing but tired hands and stubborn mercy. The gathering wolves had begun to shift uneasily in the field, their whispers moving like dry leaves over stone, but none of them dared break the silence between the king and the Omega, who stood before him with dust on her hem and moonlight in her hair. Alara could feel every gaze on her, but the one that mattered most felt impossibly steady. Not cold, not cruel, just steady, as if the man before her had already seen enough to know that something precious had been hidden in plain sight. One of the pups stirred and made a tiny noise against her chest. Immediately, Alara lowered her chin and stroked his back with slow, careful fingers. "It is all right," she murmured, more to the frightened little heart than to anyone else. "You are safe now." The words should have sounded foolish in a field full of wolves who had spent the night searching in vain. But the Alpha King's expression changed at once, as if the simple promise had reached him deeper than any report or warning ever could. His eyes moved to her face, to the weariness she had tried to hide, to the faint tremble in her hands. "You stayed with them all night," he said quietly. It was not a question. Alara's throat tightened. She had no answer that would not sound too small for what had happened. She simply gave a short nod and kept her gaze lowered, because being seen had never felt like safety before. It had only meant being judged. Yet the king did not look away. He stepped closer, slow enough that no one could mistake his approach for threat, and the air around him carried that same deep, winter-clean scent the territory had recognized the moment he arrived. Up close, it was almost overwhelming, not because it was harsh, but because it was grounded, certain, unshaken. One of the pups lifted his head from her sleeve and peered at him with sleepy, trusting eyes. Instead of reaching for authority, the Alpha King knelt. The movement startled several wolves in the crowd, and Alara felt her breath catch before she could stop it. A king did not kneel for anyone, not in front of his pack, not in front of an Omega no one had bothered to name. But he lowered himself until he was level with the little prince in her arms, his presence suddenly smaller, gentler, almost human. "You were frightened," he said to the pup, his voice softer now, nearly a whisper. "And someone stayed." The pup blinked. Then, to Alara's surprise, he leaned forward and pressed his tiny face into the front of her cloak as if he understood every word. The king's jaw tightened for only a moment, not with anger, but with something that looked almost painfully close to emotion. Then his gaze lifted again, settling on Alara with a new kind of attention. "Why did you take them?" he asked. The question was simple. The answer was not. Alara swallowed and glanced down at the children sleeping against her. Their paws were curled in toward their bodies, their breathing finally even, their small faces no longer twisted by hunger. "Because no one else did," she said at last. The words came out so softly that she almost wished the wind would carry them away. But the Alpha King heard every one of them. The silence that followed was heavy and clear, as if the whole field had been waiting for that truth to be spoken aloud. Something in his face shifted then, not into pity, but into recognition. He looked at the pups, at her, at the way she still held them as though they were not a burden, but a promise. And for the first time, Alara saw the king as more than a shadow wrapped in power. She saw a man who understood exactly what it meant when the world turned away. His hand rose, paused in the air between them, then settled over the edge of her cloak with the lightest touch, as careful as if he were afraid of startling both her and the sleeping children. "Then you will not be alone in this again," he said. The words were so quiet that only she could hear them, but they landed in her chest with a force that made her pulse stumble. Around them, the pack remained still. The moon hung above the broken fence. The cold night air moved through the grass. And beneath the king's hand, the little princes slept on, warm and protected for the first time in far too long, while Alara stared up at the man who had just spoken as though her life might be changing in a single breath. Alara should have felt relief when the king's hand lifted from her cloak, but instead her chest stayed tight with the strange ache of being noticed. The three little princes were still asleep against her, their small breaths warm against the night air, and that alone kept her rooted in place. She could not bring herself to move first. Around her, the field had gone quiet in the way only powerful things could make a room quiet. Even the restless wolves seemed to understand that something had shifted beyond words. The Alpha King was still looking at her, not like a ruler inspecting something useful, and not like a man searching for a quick answer, but like someone trying to remember the shape of a memory he had nearly lost. Alara lowered her gaze before that look could find too much of her. Her fingers tightened gently around the edge of the cloak as if she could hide inside its fabric. She had never been someone important. Not to the pack. Not to the world. Tonight, she had simply done what needed to be done. Feed the hungry. Warm the cold. Keep three frightened little hearts beating through the dark. That was all. It had never felt like courage to her. Only necessity. But the king stepped closer, and the air changed again. Not harsher, just deeper, heavier with a quiet kind of attention that made her pulse stumble. He did not reach for the pups. He did not demand explanations. Instead, his eyes moved over the tiny, sleeping faces with a tenderness so unexpected that Alara almost forgot to breathe. One of the princes stirred, curling deeper into her arms with a soft sound that made her instinctively shift him higher against her chest. The movement was small, almost nothing, yet the king noticed. Of course he noticed. His gaze followed the gentle way she held them, the careful balance of exhaustion and protection in her arms, and something unreadable passed over his expression. Alara felt it then, the dangerous edge of being seen too clearly. Not judged, not mocked. Seen. It was more unsettling than either mercy or cruelty because she did not know what to do with it. The night wind moved through the broken fence behind them, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. Far off, someone in the pack cleared their throat and then went still again, as if afraid to interrupt whatever had begun between the king and the Omega who stood in front of him with 3 sleeping princes and a heart she had taught herself not to trust. Alara finally lifted her eyes. It was a mistake and a miracle at once. The king's face was carved in shadow and moonlight, but there was no hardness in it now, only a quiet, almost unfamiliar kind of regard. His voice, when it came, was lower than the wind. "You kept them alive," he said. It was not a question. Alara swallowed. Her throat felt too dry for truth, but truth was all she had. "They were hungry," she said simply. The answer made something flicker in his eyes, something like disbelief turning slowly into understanding. To him, perhaps, this had been a matter of fate. To her, it had only been one long night of trying not to let small bodies grow cold in her arms. Yet when he looked at her again, it was as if those two truths had become one and the same. The king inclined his head, just slightly. It was such a small gesture, but in the silence of that field it felt larger than a crown. Around them, the waiting wolves watched with held breath, as if they understood that a line had been crossed and there would be no going back from it. Alara did not know whether to step away or stay. She only knew that when the Alpha King spoke again, his next words were not for the pack. They were for her alone, spoken softly enough that they felt almost sacred in the cold air. "Then you will come with us," he said, and though the command was gentle, it carried the weight of a promise. For the first time in a very long time, Alara did not hear dismissal in a royal voice. She heard shelter, and beneath the cloak, 3 tiny princes slept on, safe at last, while the girl who had fed them stood trembling on the edge of a life she had never dared to imagine. The morning after the king's arrival did not feel like morning at all. It felt like the world was holding its breath. Alara stood outside the little lodge with the 3 wolf pup princes sleeping under a thick wool blanket at her side, while the pack moved around her in careful, uneasy silence. No one laughed now. No one pointed. Even the servants who had once looked through her now lowered their eyes as they passed, as if they were afraid the air itself might betray them. Alara kept one hand near the blanket out of habit, listening to the small, steady sounds of the pups breathing. They had eaten until their bellies were round, and for the first time since she had found them, the worry line between her shoulders had eased. Yet the calm only made her more aware of everything else. The polished boots approaching across the wooden floor, the scent of cedar and winter air, the quiet authority that seemed to come before the Alpha King even entered a room. He stepped into the doorway without fanfare, but the space changed anyway. His gaze went first to the pups, then to her face, and something unreadable moved behind his eyes. "They slept through the night," he said. Alara nodded once, suddenly aware of how small she felt beneath his attention. "They were very tired," she answered softly. It was such a simple exchange, and yet it felt dangerous, because simple things were never simple around a king. He moved closer, not enough to crowd her, only enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence in the cold lodge. His voice lowered. "You stayed with them all night." Alara looked down at the blanket. They needed someone. For a moment, he said nothing. Then one of the pups stirred, let out a tiny whimper, and Alara's hand moved at once, gentle and sure, smoothing the blanket without waking him. The king saw it. She felt that he saw it, the instinct in her hands, the tenderness she did not know how to hide. His expression shifted in a way she could not name, almost like disbelief giving way to something quieter, something older. "Most people would have called for help and walked away," he said. Alara's throat tightened. She had spent most of her life hearing those kinds of sentences spoken about her, not to her, as if she were the sort of person people left behind. She swallowed and kept her gaze on the sleeping pups. "I could not walk away," she said. The king's eyes remained on her. The silence stretched just long enough to make her nervous, and then, with the careful precision of someone placing a precious object into safe hands, he asked, What are their names? Alara blinked. No one had asked her that yet. No one had spoken, as though she might be the one to know them best. Her fingers tightened lightly on the blanket, and in that small pause, she realized how much the question mattered. It meant he was not only looking at the princess. He was looking at her, waiting for her answer, trusting her judgment in a way she had not been trusted before. The smallest one is Finch, she said after a breath. He is always the first to wake. The king's mouth softened almost imperceptibly. Alara continued, feeling the words come easier now. The middle one is Rowan. He acts brave, but he is the one who reaches for the others when he thinks no one is watching. And the eldest is Ash. He pretends he does not need comfort, but he listens to everything. As she spoke, the king's face grew still, and she could not tell whether he was surprised or moved or both. He turned slightly toward the bed, where the three little princes lay hidden beneath her blanket, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost rough with feeling. You learned them well. Alara's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear. I watched them, she admitted. Someone had to. The king looked back at her then, and this time his gaze did not feel like a test. It felt like recognition. Outside, the wind brushed the walls, but inside the lodge, every breath seemed to carry weight. Then his hand lifted, not fast, not demanding, only offering, palm open in front of her, as if he were giving her the choice to take it or not. Alara stared at that hand. It was a king's hand, strong and sure, and yet there was nothing cold in the gesture. It was not an order. It was an invitation. She should not have hesitated. Yet she did, because a life like hers had taught her that offers were often traps and kindness was often temporary. His eyes did not leave her face. Come with us, he said again, quieter this time, as if he understood the fear beneath her stillness. Not as a servant, not as a favor, as someone these boys trust. The words landed in her like warmth. She looked down at the pups, then at the king, and for one impossible moment, she felt the shape of a future opening where there had only ever been closed doors. But before she could answer, the eldest pup stirred beneath the blanket, and his little hand fumbled free, clutching for her sleeve as if even in sleep he knew where safety lived. Alara froze, breath caught. The Alpha King saw it too. His expression changed, deep and immediate, like a truth had finally stepped into the light. And when he spoke the next words, they were not loud, but they carried so far in the stillness that Alara felt them settle into the bones of the room. They have chosen you, he said, and now so have I. By the time the sun climbed higher, Alara had already learned that kindness in a palace could feel as fragile as glass. She stood near the wide stone steps with her hands folded tightly together, the three little princes tucked safely beside her in the children's wing, where the air smelled faintly of cedar, milk, and clean linen. A nurse had brought them warm broth in little wooden bowls. Another had set out soft blankets. No one said the word servant anymore, but Alara still felt the old habit in her shoulders, the instinct to make herself smaller whenever an important person entered the room. She had lived too long learning how to disappear. The Alpha King had not asked her to vanish. That was the hardest part to understand. He had left one of his guards outside the wing and another near the hall, but not to watch her as if she were a prisoner. To protect her, he had said. The thought made her uneasy in a way she did not know how to name. Protection had always come with a price in her life. It had never been free. She was adjusting the blanket over the smallest pup when footsteps echoed from the corridor. Alara looked up and saw the king approaching alone, his coat dark against the pale morning light spilling through the high windows. He moved with the same quiet force she remembered from the night before, every step deliberate, every glance aware. Yet there was something different now. He was not walking toward a subject. He was walking toward her. Alara's fingers stilled on the edge of the blanket. One of the pups lifted his head, recognized the king, and let out a tiny sound that was half yawn, half greeting. The Alpha King's mouth softened, almost into a smile. It was such a small change that anyone else might have missed it, but Alara saw it and felt something in her chest loosen. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to see the tiredness beneath his composure, the strain he had been holding back all morning. Have they eaten? He asked. His voice was quieter here, less royal and more human. Alara nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. He studied her for a moment, and she could feel the weight of his attention without looking directly at him. And have you? The question surprised her. It should not have. It was such a simple thing to ask. But no one had ever asked it with real concern, as though her hunger mattered. Her throat tightened before she could answer. A little, she said. It was not a lie exactly. She had taken a few bites after making sure the pups had eaten first. The king seemed to understand the truth beneath her words. He glanced toward the tray on the table, where one bowl of broth sat untouched. Without a word, he reached for it, then set it down again beside her. Then eat more, he said. Alara blinked, caught off guard by the command and the gentleness buried inside it. It was not how Lord spoke to girls like her. It was not how anyone spoke to girls like her. Her fingers tightened at her sides. I am fine, she said automatically. The king's gaze did not harden, but it deepened. No, he replied, and somehow the single word held no cruelty at all. It held certainty. He looked toward the children, then back to her. You kept them alive. You stayed through the cold. You did not leave when they cried. His eyes moved over her face as if seeing the strain she had ignored for days. That is not nothing, Alara. Hearing her name from him made her breath catch. It sounded different in his voice, less like a label and more like recognition. She looked away before he could see how much it affected her. Outside the open window, wind moved through the courtyard trees, stirring pale leaves against the morning sky. Somewhere below, the pack was moving through its day in hushed, careful rhythms. But up here the room felt suspended, as if the whole world had narrowed to this single exchange. The king lowered himself into the chair beside the table, not grandly, not for show. Simply because he chose to sit where she could not easily be made to feel small. Tell me what you need, he said. Alara let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped inside her for years. Nobody had ever asked her that either. Not with patience. Not like the answer might matter. She stared at the broth, then at the three little princes curled together beneath the blanket. Their tiny bodies rose and fell in sleep, safe and warm. She had not meant to become attached. She had only meant to keep them alive until someone more important arrived. But now there was a strange ache in her heart, a protective tenderness she could not put away even if she wanted to. They need more firewood at night, she said at last, her voice low, and softer cloth for their beds. The smallest one wakes when the wool scratches his skin. The king listened without interrupting, as if every detail mattered. Alara hesitated, then added, and they do not like being left alone after sunset. A shadow moved through his eyes, quick and controlled. Neither do you, he said. The word struck close to something she had never spoken aloud. Alara looked at him sharply, but he did not seem to regret saying it. He only watched her with a steadiness that was almost difficult to endure. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then one of the pups stirred and reached blindly through the blanket, his little hand brushing against Alara's sleeve. Instantly, he quieted again, settling when he found her warmth still there. The king saw the movement. His expression changed in a way that made her pulse falter. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. As though a piece that had been missing had finally found its place. They trust you completely, he said. Alara swallowed. They are only babies. No, he answered softly. They are princes. The word should have felt distant, ceremonial, and cold. Instead it carried a kind of hope that made the room seem brighter. The king rose slowly and crossed to the window, looking out over the grounds as if thinking carefully before speaking again. When he turned back, the light caught the sharp line of his face, the restraint in his posture, and for the first time Alara noticed something beneath the power he wore so naturally. He was afraid. Not of her. For her. There are people in this pack who will not welcome what they see here, he said. Some will question why you were the one they turned to. Some will say things they should have never been allowed to say. Alara's hands went cold. She knew that voice too well. The world had always found reasons to reduce her. I can leave, she said before she could stop herself. The words came out too quickly, too practiced. The king turned fully toward her. No, he said, firmer this time. You can rest. Alara stared at him. Rest was not a word she associated with her own life. It belonged to other people, other girls who had homes and families and soft places to land. You do not understand, she whispered. People like me do not stay in places like this. His gaze held hers, unwavering. People like you, he said, are exactly the reason places like this must change. The sentence settled into the room with quiet force. Alara felt it in her ribs, in the careful beat of her heart, in the silence that followed. No one had ever spoken to her as though she belonged in the center of anything. She did not know how to answer. Before she could find the words, one of the youngest pups woke fully and made a small distressed sound. Instantly, Alara moved, lifting him against her shoulder with the ease of practice. His tiny body relaxed the moment he was held. The king watched her with a stillness that felt almost reverent. When the pup tucked his face against her neck and stopped crying, the king's eyes lifted to hers. Something in them had deepened into decision. "Stay here today," he said. "All day, if you are willing." Alara's lips parted, but no sound came. He seemed to understand that her silence was not refusal. It was disbelief. "The boys want you," he said. And then, after a pause that felt important, "And I would like to speak with you again when you are ready." He gave her one last look, not pressing, not demanding, only present. Then he turned and began to leave the room. Alara stood very still, the smallest prince sleeping against her shoulder, the others breathing softly beneath the blanket. And just before the king reached the doorway, he stopped and glanced back. The morning light framed him in gold and shadow, and in that brief stillness he looked less like a ruler and more like a man standing at the edge of something he had not expected to feel. "No one will send you away," he said. The words were calm, certain, a promise, not a threat. Then he was gone, and Alara remained in the quiet with 3 tiny lives trusting her hands and a future that, for the first time, did not feel like a door closing. By evening, the palace had gone quiet in the way only important places could go quiet, as if every corridor had learned to lower its voice around the children sleeping inside it. Alara sat near a tall window in the nursery wing, one hand resting lightly over the blanket that covered the 3 little princes. Their breathing was soft, and even now, their bellies full, their cheeks warmer than they had been when she first found them, and the sight kept a careful ache in her chest because it was so simple and so rare to see them at peace. The room around her glowed with the last gold of sunset. Dust floated in the light. The polished floor reflected the pale shape of her dress, the bowed line of her shoulders, the careful way she still held herself as if one wrong movement might shatter the fragile mercy of this day. She had almost begun to believe the king's promise when the knock came. Not loud, not harsh, just one measured sound at the door. Alara looked up at once. A maid entered first, then stepped aside with a small, nervous bow. And behind her stood the Alpha King, tall and still, with the evening light catching the edges of his dark coat. He was not wearing a crown. Somehow that made him feel more powerful, not less. He entered the room as if he understood that the sleeping children mattered more than the authority he carried into every other space. His gaze moved first to the 3 small figures under the blanket, and something unreadable softened in his face before he looked at Alara. "They are resting well," he said quietly. It was not a question. It was a shared relief. Alara stood at once, instinct and respect pulling her upward. "Yes, my king." Her voice came out soft, almost careful enough to disappear. He noticed that too. He seemed to notice everything. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Somewhere far down the hall, a door closed. The sound reached them faintly and vanished. The king's hands remained at his sides, open, empty, unthreatening. Then he said, "You should not have had to carry this burden alone." Alara lowered her eyes before she could stop herself. No one had ever spoken to her that way. Not with anger, not with pity, with recognition. The words sat in her chest like warmth. "I did not know what else to do," she murmured. "You did what others would not," he replied. "You gave them shelter when there was none." His voice was steady, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something like restraint giving way to truth. Alara felt it even before she understood it. Then one of the princes shifted in his sleep and gave a tiny, sleepy sigh. The king's gaze moved instantly to the child, and Alara saw the tension leave his shoulders by a breath, as if even that little sound had reached him in a place no one else could touch. He crossed the room slowly and stopped beside the bed. The nursery seemed to hold its breath with him. When he looked down at the children, his expression was no longer the expression of a ruler deciding what the kingdom needed. It was the expression of a father who had found something he had feared was gone forever. Alara's fingers tightened together. She did not dare move. He spoke again, and this time his voice was rougher, quieter. "They do not stir for the nurses." Alara glanced up, uncertain. "They only settled when I came near," he continued, and for the first time, he looked almost startled by his own words. "And when you touched them, they stopped trembling." The room seemed to narrow around that truth. Alara's heart beat hard, then harder still, because she was beginning to understand that the children had not only trusted her. They had recognized something in her, something that belonged, somehow, to this family. The king turned toward her. His eyes, dark and direct, held hers without mercy and without cruelty. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Have you ever met them before today?" Alara's breath caught. The question was gentle, but it carried the weight of a door opening. She looked toward the sleeping princes, toward the king, toward the impossible line between what she was and what this moment was asking of her. Her mouth parted, but before she could answer, one of the little princes stirred, opened his eyes for a brief heartbeat, and reached one small hand toward the king without fear. The Alpha King went perfectly still. Something changed in the room then, something so deep and quiet it felt like the first stone of a new world being laid. Alara saw it before he said it, saw the realization move through him like light through smoke. His hand lifted slowly, as though he was afraid any sudden motion might break the moment, and when the child's tiny fingers closed around his, the king closed his eyes for one silent second. When he opened them again, they were glistening with a feeling he did not try to hide. "My sons know you," he said, and the words were not accusation. They were astonishment. Alara could only stare. The truth had begun to rise, soft and inevitable, from beneath all the things no one had said aloud. The king looked from the child to her, and then back again, as if every detail had finally found its place. "And if they know you," he said slowly, "then perhaps I was meant to find you much earlier than I did." Outside, the evening bells began to ring across the palace grounds, one deep note after another, filling the air with a solemn beauty that seemed to belong to this exact moment and no other. The sleeping prince sighed and settled once more against the pillow. Alara felt tears sting her eyes, though she did not let them fall. She had spent so long believing that being seen would only lead to pain. Yet here, beneath the hush of the nursery and the low gold of sunset, the Alpha King was looking at her as if she were not a mistake in the story, but the reason it had been waiting to begin.